we've talked about the Indian growth story being a sort of exceptional story, and there's no doubt about it. Very few countries have sustained the kind of growth episodes that India's sustained, and that's an exceptional story. But at the end of the day, India is a developing economy, and there are structural features that India shares with developing economies which don't make us very exceptional. So what I really wanted to do was put out some headline messages about what is it in the nature of business-government relationships or state-business relationships that's pretty common across the board in developing economies. We're now working in, from SOAS, we're now working in Nigeria and Tanzania and Bangladesh. They actually exhibit very similar features. And really the most critical feature of developing economies is the fact that we do not have enough or adequate formal fiscal transfers available through the taxation envelope. The presence of a large informal sector, and, even though if you're very familiar with the state of the Indian economy, you know the Arjun Sen-Gupta report of 2004, it might be a little dated, but I think it still speaks to this fact very well. The 93% of the non-agricultural workforce in India is actually in the informal sector. That gives an idea of really how small the productive sector is and how, well, ineffectively, therefore, it can be taxed. So it's really the lack of a productive sector and the demand for redistribution don't really square up. So there will always be the need for informal financing, and that's why you need to link it in with the business-government linkages. It's a feature across developing economies. India really is no exception there. And as a rule of thumb, and I think Mr. Shekhar isn't here, he asked that question as to is there an optimal level of growth? I'm not sure there is an optimal level of growth, but it certainly does. More rule-following economies and universal contractual economies seem to emerge as countries to middle and at least upper middle income, as I've said there. And you have broad-based productive sectors. It can't be one oil well spewing out $1 million every day. That doesn't make it a broad-based productive sector. We're talking about employment generating. We are talking about a capitalism which is redistributive and formal. That's not where we are. And as I've mentioned, universal contractual relationships benefit all firms. That's not where we are now. It's something that Kunal and Shobhashachi spoke to also. India is still a $1,600 per capita economy. Most of our large business houses operate in fairly opaque oligopolistic markets. It's not in their interests to move to rule of law. You only move to rule of law when everybody is at a broad swathe of relative productivity and a high level of relative productivity. So that's really fact number one. That's the elephant in the room in the table. For all of us wanting to push rule-based politics, there is something fundamentally constraining in the structure of developing economies, and that's really what India is. And I've really just highlighted that over here. And as just by way of a proxy, this is what the BSE looks like. There are more than 5,400 companies listed on the BSE. The top 500 make up 95% of that. It's a very liquid stock exchange. I know some of you can say, but the FTSE 500 is pretty much the same. But the difference is, those in the FTSE which are not in the top 500 have higher rates of returns, higher rates of profits, higher levels of productivity. So for somebody who's willing to invest, it's still much more, the remuneration is higher, and it's a reflection of the differences in productive capabilities, really, that we are talking about here. And India certainly doesn't fit this grade. So to just summarize the first slide, rule-following institutions really only emerge after you've made that transition organically from low income to higher income, and that's where we stand. And the other interesting feature of developing economies that works across the board is something that we identify as reversible patron-client relationships. Now, in the literature, the politician or the political organization is usually the patron, the business organization is usually the client, and it's a transactional relationship, a sort of quid pro quo. I'm going to give you this policy privilege. You fund me for whatever the reason might be. But given a political settlement, and by political settlement, we essentially mean a distribution of power between political organizations. But given a political settlement which is fragmenting, where there are many competing political organizations, what can actually happen is business can capture some of those political privileges, so the roles get reversed. The patron actually becomes the business house, which, depending on what the sector is, can actually have very, very damaging consequences for the economy. And we've seen that through the years, whether you talk about the years of dirigism, whether you talk through the years of post-liberalization, or even now. This is something that is a feature of the Indian economy, and quite palpably so. We've talked about this. I knew that Alan Shobhashachi would also be talking about business-government relations in the Congress era, so I'm not going into that in greater detail. I just wanted to highlight something that's been touched upon, but it would be good to go through this because it ties into my work on Tamil Nadu, which is that there were two significant changes happening in the political sphere and in the economic sphere in the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s, you had the dominant party system of the Congress breaking down because there were needs for more redistribution, because social mobilization was actually growing. You had a lot of political organizations springing up and this speaks to the idea of regional political settlements, or that the regions have their own political economy. The interesting thing is not all of them came up as breakaways from the Congress. In fact, apart from probably the NCP in Maharashtra and the Trinamool Congress in West Bengal, most of the other parties that evolve in this period, whether it's the three caste-based parties in UP and Bihar, the Biju Janata Dal, the Telugu Desam in Andhra Pradesh, or indeed the AIADMK in Tamil Nadu, don't come out from the Congress. They are actually products of very organic social mobilization. So this is India fraying, but it's reflecting a very changing polity. Post-liberalization, there's the second parallel track, actually, and they have feedback loops, and that's why I've included them here. You actually have a new breed of capitalists emerging from the regions. You have business houses which weren't the big business houses of yore. They were not, let's say, names that we've actually even forgotten. I mean, how many of us remember names like Khataus? But they were really big guns at one point in time, or the Oswalds. These fall by the wayside. There are some who certainly remain. But there is actually a host of smaller Indian corporates who see this growth and the fragmentation of Indian political organizations as an opportunity to build their own economic organizations. And by this time, the permit license system has actually fallen through. The political organizations from the states need rents very quickly. These economic organizations provide the perfect conduit for it. So we actually had the reason why we see such a fragmented polity in the 90s and in the 2000s is because this had become the new normal. You had a clientelist or a very competitive political settlement. You had political organizations fighting each other. You had economic organizations also able to capture some of those political organizations. And that's really the reason why the normal seemed to be a very disequilibrious sort of situation in the Indian political settlement. Right, and I've actually said this before, and some really good work done by one of my colleagues and who's also part of this ESIT project, by this gentleman called Michael Walton, actually talked about this being very, very coterminous with the American Gilded Age. Very similar things were happening in the late 19th century and the 20th century in the US. Growth was skyrocketing, but you had very high levels of inequality, and you generally had a time of great social turmoil. And that was being mapped on pretty much onto what was happening in India at that point in time. And private wealth soared. I mean, a lot of the anger that one sort of senses in India today, if you speak to people on the road, if you speak to people in the markets, a lot of it is because while there definitely was a lot of growth, it didn't seem to spill over. And we do have very, very high levels of inequality in India, whether it's assets, income. Gini coefficients are fairly high, comparable in some cases even to Latin America. So that was what typified the 1990s. And then comes the election of 2014. And new normal suddenly, you have to pause, there are breaks, and business has to recalibrate. The BJP comes in with huge numbers. What is the BJP going to do with its numbers? People are still undecided. But before I go on to what the ramifications of maybe a post-UP situation is for business-government relationships in India, I just want to talk about a few things. I began with the structural features, the constraints that the Indian political settlement faces in terms of moving to open order deals, moving to rule-following behavior, essentially. There are a few things that will make growth in India very contingent and extremely vulnerable. For instance, we have very inconsistent and regionally unequal growth. There's entrenched federalism. And when I mean entrenched federalism, I mean that it's no longer going to be possible for any dominant party system to simply say, well, there's president's rule in this state. It will be under exceptional circumstances, but not in the way that Mrs. Gandhi used it in the 1970s. And in terms of fiscal leeway, states actually have a lot more independence to spend their way through. So there's a lot of entrenched federalism, and social fragmentation really hasn't stopped. It keeps going on. This is becoming a more and more fragmented society, despite attempts at building or polarizing politics in this country today. So I happened to arrive in India at a time that the chief minister in UP was selected. It was certainly a popular choice, but it's certainly a controversial choice. I am pretty sure that beyond the paradigm of state-business relationships, it's certainly going to have very negative consequences for social cohesion in India, but that's not what we are here to talk about. Business is really interpreting what the BJP is able to push through today, and two likely scenarios really seem to be emerging. One is that there will be continuing discretionary relationships. They will be more sophisticated, they will be more nuanced, it'll be more subterranean, but we are not going to see a cessation of discretionary relationships. Elections have to be financed, but it'll be done differently. The other scenario at this level is actually that a lot of businesses are saying that there is going to be an end to discretionary relationships, but that doesn't mean that there is not going to be, very plainly put, any corruption, that there isn't going to be any give and take. It might look so, but a lot of people that I did speak to in this period actually said that what seems to be happening is there is no, we'll give you this, you give us this. It's much more, to use the word with a certain sense of irony, it's much more broad-based. The idea is that you will still need to make transfers to us, but what we promise you is nothing specific for your business. What we certainly promise you is a good business environment. There will be ease of doing business. It's almost like informal horizontal industrial policy. There's horizontal industrial policy and there's vertical. Vertical is sector specific. Horizontal is more the World Bank, Transparency International kind of industrial policy, which says, we'll give you good governance. So the promise and the carrot is good governance, level playing field, but there are still going to be transactions. And, you know, I think it was mentioned earlier at the discussion in the morning that whether it's been the US, whether it's been the UK, Germany, certainly even in high-income countries, business has needed discretion. I'm not a votary for discretion over here. I'm just stating facts as they are. Business has always needed discretion to grow. So for a certain section of business houses in this country, the fear is, what will happen to growth if such discretionary allocations are completely stopped, right? And my point is there still remains the problem. If we take the two scenarios and put them on the table, in terms of the first one where we talk about continuing discretionary relationships, there remains the question of enforcement capability. You know, we talked about the fact that patron-client relationships straddle, go across a continuum. What would this discretionary relationship mean for the current ruling coalition, the dominant party, or even for the few states, regional parties across the states? What would that mean in terms of organizational growth and capability development? Are these coalitions really going to be able to enforce any discipline that actually brings out growth outcomes? You know, South Korea under Park Chung-hee did that very effectively. Taiwan was actually able to do that. And despite, for instance, Park Chung-hee's dictatorial leadership, people came out in droves to vote for her daughter simply because they wanted to go back to some kind of notions of this woman should be able to discipline. But is that something that's possible in the Indian political settlement? Matters keep changing, but my guess is it's going to be very, very difficult for, given the structural features that I spoke about, for any sort of ruling coalition to actually be able to enforce that authority. Some states are likely to fall behind, given the fact that there are no central rents, even though we have the Make in India policy. Perhaps it's too macro without drilling down into the really specific considerations that certain growth sectors need, especially sectors which have a lot of employment potential. Tamil Nadu could possibly fall behind. West Bengal has already fallen behind. And what SAC said in 2002, that liberalization is going to be a race to the bottom for the Indian state, I think to some extent has a lot of truth in it. And even though the BJP is the dominant party now, given the need for election financing, given the GDP per capita levels that we are at, discretionary corruption will remain a key variable that will actually affect growth. That's not going out of consideration anytime soon. There was another argument that I heard that this kind of centralizing is actually some kind of informal central planning. It's going to be good for stability. It signals a kind of credible commitment. But this could lead to something that we call controlled expropriation if centralization becomes too acute. Because the BJP is in danger of becoming the behemoth it's already sort of morphing into, if they do demand for certain resource transfers, it's going to be very difficult for business to turn around and say, no, that's not going to happen. And in the medium term, that is going to have a deleterious effect on what we call animal spirits. Investment sentiments are definitely going to be affected. In fact, it's happening in trickles, but some business houses are already selling, and all our business houses are family owned. So one branch of the family has already moved to Dubai or Singapore or London. They're actually hedging their bets because no one knows where it's going. So it's poised at a very, very critical turn for India in terms of state-business relations. And I really couldn't help putting in the bit about the new UP chief minister. Not perhaps surprising, certainly not surprising, let me rephrase that. Certainly not surprising given the numbers that the BJP has managed. They can pretty much do everything that they want right now, which is scary, which could be good, depends on how you want to cut the cake. But what about kick-starting growth in UP? Is it going to sort of change the development paradigm in UP? And here what came to my mind was, and I'm not saying that Hindutva is any kind of social conservative policy in the way of Burke, etc. But social conservative politics has worked in places like Turkey. You had the Anatolian Tigers. The AKP had very, very distinct links to the Anatolian Tigers. They were a socially conservative entrepreneurial class, which was actually which was not part of the rent-sharing agreement with the generals and the secularists in Istanbul. That actually led to a lot of good growth for Turkey. At one point in time. What's happening in Turkey now is a completely different story. Or the Bazaris of Iran, which is also another very interesting. They were, again, overlooked by the Shah, but at the time of the revolution, leaders of the regime used the Bazari networks, the finance networks, to actually create some growth within Iran. But whatever be the equivalent of the Bazaris in the Indian context, they've never been outside the pale of the political establishment. Entrepreneurs have always been part of the established political establishment in India. So given this, I am not sure that the new political framework will in any way add to something that's growth-inducing. It might mean more financing for the dominant political party, but in terms of changing the growth paradigm, helping growth, I'm not sure that's going to be working in a very proactive and a successful manner.
5, 6 minutes?
Yes, I'll be more than happy with that. Thank you. And now coming back to the original subject of the paper, and Tamil Nadu, and remember, every time that we talk about India, everything's at a relative scale. Tamil Nadu is an extremely interesting state, and I think a sort of unsung star in the Indian political settlement. We keep talking Maharashtra, we keep talking Gujarat. Gujarat, great for doing business. Maharashtra, great productivity. But here is a state, again I say relatively, which has anecdotally and in an established manner now, very, very high levels of corruption. Politics, which is extremely nativist, fractious. People keep laughing at the fact that film stars for actors. We have Donald Trump as president in the US, but that's a completely different matter. Everything in Tamil Nadu points to growth really not happening, but it has. It has, well, till at least 2012, it had some of the highest growth rates of FDI, and in absolute terms, in terms of employment creation, in terms of having some of the most high value added sectors. Tamil Nadu is an extremely important cog in the wheel for the auto and the auto component sector. And this is the contingent part of the Indian political settlement. A lot of it happened by accident, but indeed it did happen. It happened in a sort of situation where it shouldn't have happened, but here it is. I mean, I can name other states. I can name West Bengal, where they had fairly similar situations, but West Bengal is going down another track, which I don't want to get into now. But just to very quickly take you through Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu was lucky in the 1960s, and however much we criticize the so-called license permit system of the 1960s, and Anu Kunal has talked to it, Tamil Nadu was lucky because it had 3 very strong Congress ministers at the center who were actually able to make some very good links for business houses based in the state. I can name the TVS Group, the Ranes, TAFE, Amalgamated. These were all auto component companies, even Standard Motors, which is now, of course, seized and become defunct. But TAFE, Ashok Leyland then, Amalgamated, all these companies have actually grown from strength to strength within the Tamil political settlement. So you had people like C. Subramaniam, you had people like T. Krishnamachari, TTK, R. Venkataraman, and a very proactive chief minister in Kamraj who used his links with Delhi to get a lot of licenses, permits, and land. So the entire industrial complex in Paddy today, where you have TVS, Paddy back in the day was outside Chennai. Chennai has actually expanded much more to include it, but all that land was part of LRGs which used discretionary business-government relationships. So what really matters is how is discretion being used? For the most part, discretion for Indian business houses resulted in capture. In Tamil Nadu, there were specific circumstances which didn't lead to capture, which actually led to productivity growth, which is why I find Tamil Nadu a really interesting example within the Indian political settlement. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Tamil Nadu did go through a bit of a depression, economic depression. Also, the other fact about Tamil Nadu is it's not a paragon of virtue. Caste violence, redistributive caste violence is extremely egregious in the state, and you can't condone any sort of violence, but it's still based on a social mobilization, which actually goes back to Periyar's Self-Respect Association. And these kind of social mobilizations have an institutional overlay. What happens in the 1980s is there's competitive clientelism between the DMK and the AIA-DMK, both of whom might have a core constituency which is different, but actually the messaging is similar, and the philosophy it comes from is very similar too. So the competition between them is very intense, but the policies they have to implement can't diverge because really the constituencies they're speaking to are very similar. And because the constituencies are very socially evolved and well mobilized, industrialization, programmatic politics of the midday meal scheme, which all of us know about, and employment generation has had to be a priority for these two states. And what ends up happening is because the competition was so fierce, and this is something that my PhD was on Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, and in my conversation with a lot of people who have business interests in Tamil Nadu, what came up was very interesting, was the 70-30 rule, that the incumbent would keep 70% of the kickback, the party in opposition would keep 30% of the impact of the kickback, because 5 years later, you'd actually have the opposition today in power. So the live and let live actually worked very well, and we've had a cycling in and cycling out till it was actually stopped by Jayalalitha's earlier term, AIADMK's earlier term, but you had about 5 or so election cycles where you had a cycling in and cycling out. And this kind of produced an informal credible commitment mechanism to businesses, which actually said, here is a state which doesn't renege on investments. It's not like the BSP, SP, which says, the SP did this, I can't do this. That wasn't happening in Tamil Nadu. So you had a lot of investments in high productivity, high value added sectors, which needed state backing initially, but then because they were competitive sectors, didn't need the state's help anymore, unlike in Gujarat, which was very, very resource rich and needed state intervention right through because you needed permits, you needed licensing, and the entire regulatory aspect of resource-rich economies. Tamil Nadu, again, another big positive, by no way is Tamil Nadu resource-rich. It's a state which has very little water. It can't go the agrarian way. It has very little resources. All of its resources have to be internally generated, which is why I think there are good and bads in the Tamil story, and really the auto sector becomes a proxy for Tamil Nadu's development trajectory. All that has worked, as I said, this informal credible commitment, and all that is contingent, again, this informal credible commitment, because there is no policy package that can actually recreate this system of informal credible commitment. So what do policymakers do in such contingent situations? And we were talking about employment generation and redistribution, and to my mind, taking the auto sector into account, I think what's going to be most damaging is there is a swathe of tier 3 suppliers and SME suppliers in the auto component sector in Tamil Nadu, which are actually going to suffer greatly, because what we have now are the two parties in a state of crisis, whether it's a dynastic party or whether it's a personality-based party. It's a state of flux. Governing time horizons have shortened. Usually, again, as a rule of thumb, when governing time horizons are shortened, you actually have more damaging variants of corruption because people simply want to transfer resources as fast as possible because they don't know if they're going to be in power for the next election cycle. So, and there will therefore be the need for more informal redistribution to fund elections. There will be also the need for wider inclusion. And the state is already facing a crisis in agriculture, in employment generation, and the older social compact of caste is actually breaking down. It's a state in a state of flux, which doesn't really augur well for the productive sectors in the economy. And it's done extremely well. The auto sector has been, so far, very good at lobbying for very high value added things like, for instance, just a small anecdote, because a lot of political economy analysis is anecdotal, something called the NATRIP, which is, let me get the alphabet soup right, it's the National Automotive Testing, Research and Development and Infrastructure Project, right, I've got that right. NATRIP essentially is about homologation and testing, and a country only needs homologation and testing facilities when it has a very well-developed, productive auto and auto component sector. Tamil Nadu wasn't, and the center was, this was under UPA 1, Tamil Nadu wasn't supposed to be a location for one of the NAT trips. It was supposed to be either Karnataka or Andhra Pradesh, which both had Congress governments then. Jayalalitha went and lobbied very hard, and she said, well, if the center doesn't give us NAT trip, I will make one here. The DMK, which was then in the center, said, hang on, we can get you NAT trip. Whatever it is, this competitive clientelism worked. And they opened this center near Oragadam on the way to Siriperumbudur in that entire industrial cluster that we have. So business had some leveraging power, but it's still not competitive or productive enough to resist the kind of rent seeking that is surely going to be a part of the Tamil political settlement in the next few years. And there's already increasing competition from auto and auto component hubs, which were not traditional auto and auto component hubs. They were industrial hubs, but Tamil Nadu is losing out. And it's easy for me to sit and talk here. I'm really not sure what can be done except to say that all said and done, bureaucrats need to ring fence these sectors. And these are not very politically connected sectors. They're not politically leveraged sectors. So they're not consequential in that sense, except that they need to be protected. So it's easier. You're not upsetting any dispensation of power by saying that let's look at what we can do for tier 3 or what we can do for the SMEs in the replacement sector. I'm not talking about Coimbatore, where the smaller industrial clusters are actually well connected. I'm actually done. So, so I really wanted to break down the presentation from giving an overall map down into how, whether at the all India level or indeed at the state level, growth in India is extremely contingent, because at the end of the day, it is still a $1,600 per capita economy. Elections need to be financed. Redistribution needs to be financed. The tax take isn't as much. And essentially, hoping for rule of law is actually, a rule of law of the sort of Western OECD kind, is actually going to divert attention from the sectors that really need any kind of reform and hand-holding. I'll end with that because I know that the discussants would have a lot to say. So thank you very much.